So today let's do an overview of 3D printing and talk about some of the realities of using it to support a hobby of Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 3D printing and Warhammer, a bit of an overview and discussion of the space, all the different things that people use 3D printing for, maybe a few of the norms that I've seen when applied to events and people's attitude to the new technology, and a few of the positives and negatives. This video was kind of motivated by the kind folks at Elegoo sponsoring a 3D printed video on the channel. They basically sent me one of theirs to check out, and I felt like if we were doing a sponsored video around 3D printing, we may as well try and make something useful of it and talk about it when applied to all of 40k. I'm sure it's a technology that a lot of people are kind of eyeing up at the moment. Definitely one way to get a lot of more flexible models on the table if you want to, though it is kind of a hobby in its own right. For trying to make something useful for my channel, I thought rather than try and go into the fine details of technical 3D printing, it might make a bit more sense to do a bit more of a discussion of the applications of getting into it, as I feel like there's all manner of guides for people showing you practically how to use 3D printers, but maybe not so much of an exploration of how people practically use it for 40k modelling. If I slip up a bit on any technicalities, feel free to correct me down in the comments. I'll try and post a pinned comment for anything that I've got too wrong. So first up, 3D printing for Warhammer 40k, why would you bother in the first place? I think first up, just to a lot of people, the idea of doing it in the first place is quite good fun. In the past, making your own miniatures has generally been confined to buying things from other parties, either Games Workshop or elsewhere, and then you put them together at home, potentially doing some conversions, or maybe even sculpting things out of green stuff or something. So the idea of basically turning yourself into your own miniature factory that can print as much stuff as you want really is quite a cool one. It's definitely a hot topic in miniature wargaming at the moment, with basically the technology just about arriving to the extent where it's fairly cheap and fairly practical, and depending on exactly what you want out of Warhammer, it can definitely be an economical way to get a whole bunch of models on the table, and some pretty cool ones at that. There's a whole ton of applications for Warhammer players. Maybe the first and most obvious one would literally just be printing whole models and whole armies. There's lots of YouTube reviews that do exactly that. The usual system for that is usually to print some close proxies of one sort or another. There's all sorts of miniature creators out there making the STL files for 3D printing. Their typical aim is to try and make things that are close to Games Workshop's products, but far enough away that they're legally distinct and Games Workshop can't go after them and take down their files. I feel like Games Workshop's always going to be fighting a bit of a losing battle on that front. Even if they did feel that some of the designs maybe overstep the mark a little bit, they can't really afford to go too hard after any one of them, just due to the sheer amount of people in the space making similar proxies. You can get something that, say, looks very similar to a Grey Knight army, or an Astra Militarum army, everything basically the same but kind of aesthetically different. I'd certainly argue that a lot of these alternative sculpts out there are also better than Games Workshop's originals, particularly a few of the sculpts that people feel maybe are a tiny bit goofy looking. Say the Nemesis Dread Knight has had its fair amount of criticism as a bit of a baby carrier. I've seen a few people make some alternate versions of that, say for example the Silver Warden's Dreadwalker Demon Slayer Knight, an STL that it looks like you can pick up for £15.60 from a creator called DMG Minis of Courts 3D. They have to give them some slightly legally distinct names so they aren't just ripping off Games Workshop's names one for one, but often similar to this one, the words Dread and Knight do all seem to pop up within the same awkwardly long model title. In reality, it often means that if you search Games Workshop Dread Knight 3D printed, you might have a fair few options like this pop up. As well as these creators that are towing the line, you do also get people who are just literally trying to rip off Games Workshop stuff exactly, basically trying to scan in miniatures and reprint them. I strongly suspect that if you're copying Games Workshop's miniatures exactly and selling them, that's probably over the line for copyright infringement or something. Not a legal expert on that one, but it certainly seems a fair bit more dodgy to me compared with selling miniatures that are lookalikes that you've sculpted yourself. As well as just having cool or different miniatures though, obviously price is a massive motivator for picking up armies this way. Games Workshop's plastic kits are very expensive, often out of the reach of some people who have very tight budgets at the moment, and while 3D printing might have a bit of initial investment, it can certainly be one way to get multiple viable armies on the table, potentially hugely cheaper with buying the same plastic kits from Games Workshop if you do go for things in bulk. Otherwise, besides just printing off entire armies, weapons parts and bits are pretty ideal for 3D printing. Games Workshop sprues often don't come with the exact things that you might want, so things like different weapons and guns can be handy. Perhaps some common examples are things like Crisis Battlesuit guns. Say if you want 20 airbursting fragmentation projectors or cyclic ion blasters, you could get some generic energy weapon parts and just add them to your battlesuits and count them as that. Or maybe omnibus long guns designed to be compatible with things like Imperial Knight armigers. Say if you wanted, again, some energy weapons to count as Moirax lightning locks perhaps. For bits and parts, you might also just want them for aesthetic and theme. Say, for example, get some head swaps to fit in with your own Space Marine Legion. They can often be far cheaper and have far more options than Games Workshop offerings. Say, for example, we have the Space Mongol helmets by a design by Rob Jedi of Cults3D.com. They look like they might be pretty appropriate for White Scars if you wanted them. There's plenty of custom shoulder pads or icons to go on them for the Space Marines as well. Plus it can be quite nice for particular themed weapons for, say, a chapter or something. Say getting some storm shields with a chapter appropriate logo on the front, perhaps some nice shields with thunderbolts if you're going White Scars for example, or getting a whole bunch of snazzy axes, say if you wanted to convert some Space Wolves Blade Guard. Otherwise, besides actually making miniatures themselves, there's plenty of applications for the supporting things around the 40k hobby. In a miniature wargame, there's going to be a lot of demand for things that are made custom and small, so it fits in great with 3D printers. Terrain is a particularly popular one. Games Workshop stuff is a bit on the pricey side, and generic stuff really isn't too hard to find online. It's particularly quite useful as that can be printed on the cheaper FDM printers as well, so really quite usable for slightly rougher looks of buildings where it doesn't matter if they have a little bit of detail loss. Bases are another pretty good application as well. You might just want literally the right size of things to stand on, and 3D printing could be the cheapest way to get you a whole load of appropriate sized circles if you have either printed off your own models, or if you just need to rebase a whole ton of things because Games Workshop has changed the base size in a kit or something. Printing them off can also be a pretty easy way to get custom textures and things, rather than having to shell out for fairly expensive pre-made ones online. Again, just for one example, here's one by Modular Wargaming of Cults 3D. The file's £1.86, and it just gives you some nice broken flagstone bases, a bit more of an interesting texture just rather than the flat bases, or covering them with some sort of sand. Finally, another thing that I also see used for 40k quite a bit are 3D accessories and things, maybe custom counters like wound trackers, objective markers, or things to denote that you've done stratagems and things. Can be quite nice to have something chunky and tactile to put next to your units, just to make sure which units have the right buffs on. Maybe not strictly necessary for 40k games, particularly if you have data cards and stuff, but again another area where you can make some really nice things if you have a mind to. Overall, I'd say there's plenty of good applications for Warhammer 40k, so let's go over some very rough practicalities. First up, the main choice between 3D printer would either be a resin one or a filament one, where just as a general rule, the filament ones do tend to be cheaper and easier to use, but perhaps have some slightly more limited applications for wargaming, just because they do have a bit of detail loss and you can see the layers between the different filament ones. These are definitely getting better, but in general I would say that the resin ones are superior for tabletop wargaming. They're far more widely used if you say want to print off infantry sized models and wargear bits and things, but in general the FDM ones can still do absolutely fine for bigger tanks and vehicles, where maybe the absolute finest details aren't the biggest problems, and certainly for things like terrain. Within the resin ones you can get various different sizes and specs of them. Perhaps two of the biggest deals for miniature wargaming might be the detail and resolution that you can get on the individual model parts, the speed at which they operate, and the size of the amount of miniatures that you get actually on the print surface. That does bring us to the Elegoo Printers, who generously sponsored today's video by sending me one. Obviously I'm a bit of a novice with the technicalities of 3D printing, but in general they're certainly one of the leading brands in the space, and I've anecdotally spoken to a whole ton of people who have had good experiences with them. From their range, they really have the two main options for getting into 3D printing, either the Mars 3 Pro as a smaller and quicker one, or the Saturn II 8K one, which is bigger and higher resolution, but does cost a fair bit more. Obviously other brands exist, so feel free to do your own research, but these seem to be both perfectly decent starting points if you ask me, and have a fair few interesting design innovations that make them a bit easier to use. The Mars Pro one is £260 or $350. It gives a 4K resolution, which is fine for the vast majority of tabletop miniatures. The volume that it can print is around about 17cm by 9 by 14. And it's got a few things that I haven't seen talked about as much on other 3D printers, like an easier to release build plate plus an air purifier. It prints fairly quickly compared with bigger printers, which with more space need a bit more time. Speaking of which, maybe their slightly more upgraded Pro version is the Saturn II 8K one. Again, it's a relatively recent release from them. It is a fair bit more expensive at £483 or $550. The 8K resolution does give a bit more detail on the finest of miniatures. From anecdotes and having a look at other reviews, it does seem like it is somewhat noticeable on the finest parts of infantry models and things. You can also print out decidedly bigger volumes of miniatures at the same time as well, at 22 by 12 by 25. So you could get potentially a lot more miniatures done in one batch if you just set it and then leave it to run. It would take a bit more time though due to the volume and the detail compared with the Mars 3 Pro one. From my own experiences and everything that I've heard about them, I wouldn't have any hesitation about recommending those as one example of 3D printers that you could jump into. If you did happen to be picking one up, I do also have an affiliate link that they gave me, which is down in the video description. If you were going to pick one up anyway, then feel free to give that one a click and order it if you want to help out the channel as well. They also told me to provide the discount code MRT10OFF, which if you do pick one up, that would save you an extra $10. Maybe not a whole load, but certainly doesn't hurt. In any case, if you do wind up picking up a resin one, this is just a very rough guide to the print process, and you can see that a lot better in plenty of other YouTube videos, to be fair. The printers themselves will come in with some fairly decent instructions as to how to get them set up. Some of the tips I've most often seen mentioned by people who use 3D printing is that you really want to get that FEP sheet flat and load the resin in very safely, getting nothing on anything else that you're going to come in contact with. It basically is a bit toxic. Then on your computer, you pick the model that you want and arrange it on the bed with the software, and then you add some supports to make sure the model doesn't collapse. Sometimes you do need to add more supports than the amount that are provided by STL content creators. Some of them work okay, but if you can learn how to make a few extra really basic ones, apparently that goes a fair way into making a model more stable sometimes. I'll admit that's still above my level at the moment though. Then you need to calibrate the printer for the resin being used. Plenty of online guides exist like that, and I'd be tempted to copy either them or manufacturer instructions and go with the recommended resin. You're unlikely to have too much problems if you're going with the same thing that other people have had success with before. Set the 3D printer to print, and then from there it's likely to take you around about 2 to 8 hours, really varying quite a lot depending on what printer that you're using, and exactly how many models and how much complexity you've been putting on the build plate. From there, you release the miniatures, sliding them off the build platform with the handy metal spatula. You wash them down in isopropyl alcohol to remove uncured resin from the surface, and you can either do that manually with brushes and things, or use a wash machine that are sold by various places, including Elegoo themselves as well. Then break off the supports, and the model will need curing, likely in a cure machine using some UV light, or potentially manually using sunlight if you happen to live in a part of the world where it's very consistent. I think a cure machine is going to be the way to go in the UK most of the time. Then in theory you should have some stable and safe 3D printed miniatures of your choosing, all ready for spraying and painting, and of course there's plenty of other great guys on YouTube that go through these various steps of the process in far more detail than this. One thing I certainly would try and do with 3D printers would be to stay safe. The general advice that I've found is generally to try and treat the resin as you'd treat poison. It is toxic and you need to handle it with gloves if you're touching anything uncured. Ideally, I want to set up on a work surface and maybe around somewhere that's able to receive spills if you do manage to do anything wrong. And if you do spill any resin at any point, then you can wash things down in isopropyl alcohol to make sure that everything's nice and safe. As a slightly new technology as well, I'd be inclined to be a bit cautious of it on the air quality front as well. Plenty of them have filters and things, but even with that, I personally would be a bit dubious about spending many hours in an enclosed space with one or more 3D printers. I'd probably aim to have them set up in another room with some good ventilation, so any resin fumes that do happen to escape aren't going to be causing it any damage in the long run. Perhaps a tiny bit on the cautious side, but I feel like caution is fairly pragmatic if you are dealing with potentially harmful chemicals. Otherwise, for just a few more practicalities of 3D printing, perhaps one of the side hobbies to get things together would be the different ways that you can go about collecting STL files. There are plenty of websites and databases that have a whole ton of them, but a lot of them are fragmented across a lot of individual creators' Patreon pages and shared on Discords or forums and things, so it can well be worth keeping an ear to the ground for any particularly good libraries, as well as just going and searching the things that you're looking for at the time. Quite a lot of them are available completely for free, so it might not be the worst thing to try and harvest them when you do find a good source that you might potentially want in the future. And there's also plenty of places that seem to sell them online for reasonably low prices, particularly if you're printing off multiple models. Quartz3D.com or CG Trader are a couple of examples of those, and there's plenty of Patreons that have really quite nice sculpts on them, Maker's Cult maybe being one of the most famous. For an example from them, here's one of their Tempest Legion Marauders, basically a Horus Heresy style Space Marine with bolt pistols and jump pack. If you did get really into 3D modelling and things, you can certainly make your own miniatures and custom parts as well, potentially combining multiple things if you want to, though again that's basically another further hobby all in itself, on top of getting the 3D printing and build process set up. Next up, when you do have some 3D models printed, there can potentially be a few issues with using them in-game in certain scenarios, maybe another slight hobby grey area in the same sort of region as playing with unpainted armies or heavy use of proxies and things. In my experience at the moment, at least in local gaming stores, entire 3D printed armies do seem to have pretty good acceptance, largely seen as part of the hobby ecosystem now, and even events and tournaments which tend to have fairly strict modelling requirements do tend to be fairly accommodating. I think for the vast majority of hobbyists, if they're playing against an army that turns out to be 3D printed, their main questions might be, does it look the part, and is it clear what I'm fighting? It would be a bit annoying to be playing against a 3D printed proxy army where you can't tell what any of it is. In game terms, perhaps the main question is whether or not it's the right size and profile for the unit being represented. For example, if you had some powerful gun tanks that you got some alternatives for, if you made them significantly smaller than the original, then that would be quite a big modelling advantage, as you could hide them quite a lot better. And perhaps most importantly out of any of them might be whether or not it looks good and actually feels like you're using the units that you're representing, or whether or not it just looks like a cheap knockoff. I feel like if you've got someone who's 3D printed up an entire army to represent something, and they've put loads of hobbying effort into it, and it really looks very cool, people are going to be a lot more happy to play that rather than someone who's just printed up some very cheap tanks in a rough way, just to get the user out of some powerful rules to dominate a game. I remember that slightly infamous victory for multiple Caladius tanks sometime in 8th edition, where someone printed up a few proxies for them and then led them to a tournament victory, though I feel like most of the internet's reaction to that at the time was that they just don't look very stylish doing so. Going back to events and tournaments, at least in my experience, they tend to be reasonably accommodating of 3D printed models, but standards definitely vary from event to event. I believe that some events don't allow any 3D printed proxies whatsoever, so you certainly need to consult the rules or clarify with the tournament organiser if you're unsure. Obviously, the absolute base minimum for this is making sure that the models are clear what they are, plus having the right size for them, and I have certainly been to big and small events in the UK that have no problems accepting 3D printed armies in their entirety. Obviously, it'd be a different tune if you attend actual Games Workshop events run by themselves. They're not going to allow people to use 3D printed proxies for their things, and I'm sure you'd be asked to remove the models if you tried. I feel like I read in one of their event terms and conditions last time that if you had 3D printed bits that you sculpted yourself, they were allowed, but if you bought them off somewhere, you weren't. Perhaps in the same way that you'd be allowed to sculpt things out of green stuff and stuff, but not be able to turn up with full miniatures made by other sellers. Otherwise, in local gaming stores, they might well have their own policies. Again, in general, I'd say that most of them tend to be at least fairly accepting, but I would say that if you are turning up with 3D printed models, I'd try and make sure that you do actually support the store as well. If you don't buy things from them, then you're not going to have a place to game at anymore. I feel like it'd be pretty bad form to show up week in, week out with 3D printed models, literally spend nothing there but make use of their facilities. I would also bear in mind that you can certainly make great use of 3D printed parts while not actually owning a 3D printer at all. I think for a lot of people who maybe just don't have the time or space to use a 3D printer or get set up with it, often that can be a very good way to make use of the technology. There's a lot of people who have things that are set up to actually sell you the individual 3D bits and then they arrive through the mail. I've seen them be quite common on things like Shapeways or Etsy. I think there's plenty of eBay sellers that do similar as well. That keeps it nice and simple from your point of view. You just pay the price for the bits and then they post them to you. You get the advantage of lots of custom printed parts without the hassle of actually having to deal with a 3D printer in the first place. Obviously, the big trade-off here is that it's going to lead to a massive reduction in savings, partly just due to postage, partly due to the other person's time and effort. If you make very, very heavy use of this, then you're going to at least fairly quickly arrive at the point where it would have been more economical to buy a 3D printer and the resin yourself. But for a lot of people, it's just not going to be practical for the time invested, or just not wanting to turn into your own model miniature factory yourself and focus on actually building and painting the models. There's some people who operate 3D printed stores where they're fairly happy to print things kind of flexibly, maybe having a bit more of a conversation with their clients and what they want, and then telling them how much each individual bit would cost when they come to them with STLs. I guess if you owned a 3D printer, there'd always be the possibility of doing things like that yourself somewhat. Selling bits or things that you've sculpted yourself certainly could be an interesting little side hustle, though I feel like you'd be having to do it really quite efficiently and at quite a big scale to the extent where it might actually be worth your time for the money involved. Again, it's a bit of a trade-off as to how much your time and money is worth compared with how much free time you have on your hands. Another very common way of using 3D printers is often people will know people just within their small gaming group who happen to own one, and then they get prevailed upon for favours and things. It can be pretty cool to set yourself up as your group's own miniature arms dealer, and due to not having to bother with things like postage, they can potentially just charge small amounts for the parts they print off. That way they get a little bit of money coming in for their time, effort, and investment in the printer, and the rest of the gaming group get parts discounted to an extent even below things that they'd order online. I can see why things might develop a bit like this. It's maybe just not super efficient for literally everyone to own their own 3D printer and invest the time in it. So if a couple of people jump in, the skill can be really quite valuable to a little community. Finally, I just thought we'd run through a few pros and cons for 3D printing with regards to Warhammer and 40k. Though obviously if you can tell by the rest of the video, I do think that it's very viable and can be an absolutely valuable resource for a bunch of hobbyists. Obviously first and foremost, it can save you an enormous amount of money compared with fancy Games Workshop plastic kits, provided you're happy with the resin and the legwork. Once you're up running and get the time invested, you could certainly be printing things at around about a 10-to-1 savings ratio compared with what you would have paid to Games Workshop for the bits of plastic. The other major selling point is the massive flexibility. You can print off 20 copies of one specific bit for a project. You can get the exact aesthetic upgrades that you want for an army, and fill in gaps that Games Workshop might not have even bothered to do within their own range, and you often have much more flexibility as to the different sculpts that you could get for one model, rather than just having to go by the only ones that GW makes in plastic. It's great for stylistic upgrades, weapons, bases, and things like that. On top of all that, I feel like it's just quite satisfying. As miniature hobbyists, we do tend to be little craftsmen making and painting things, so it's really quite cool to basically have a miniature and say, yes, I 3D printed this from resin to plastic and then painted it. It's perhaps just a little bit more work of my own creation compared with stock plastic kits. Obviously though, I still would say that 3D printing isn't going to be for everyone. It's got loads of obvious upsides, but there are a few downsides as well, some of which might just be real breaking points for certain hobbyists. I'd say perhaps the single biggest one might be the time needed. If every hour of the day is taken up by your job and the family, and you only have a few dedicated hours of hobby time to play Warhammer, you might genuinely just get more fun out of your time by making and painting the models and playing games with them, rather than investing a lot of time in making yourself into a miniature factory. It'll take a bit of time to set up and learn the skills to start with, and then troubleshooting issues like failed prints, spills, and things like that. It is basically a hobby in itself as well, and I would treat it as such. Say if you're the sort of person who just paints up models very slowly, then perhaps a plastic kit every 6 months or so isn't exactly the worst investment, and you just genuinely might not get quite enough use out of a 3D printer to make it worth it. I'd say time invested might be the single main trade-off for Warhammer things, but there are a few other minor issues, things like needing somewhere suitable to print things, ideally in the house but preferably ventilated and stable and not where you're going to be sitting all day, I'd say. The stand-in miniatures can have a few downsides, such as say being prohibited at Games Workshop stores, a bigger deal if you're actually going to those regularly. While Games Workshop plastic kits are expensive, I would still say that plastic in general is nicer to work with than resin, a bit easier for sculpting and converting and stuff if you're not quite at the stage when you're making your own full-on 3D printed sculpts. A lot of people are maybe just a little bit resistant to the technology in general, maybe feeling that printing off close proxies is just a little bit cheeky to Games Workshop and not supporting the company that's making the game that they play, not necessarily liking the quality or feel of the resin models that they play with, or maybe not quite liking the aesthetic compared with full-blooded things that comes from Games Workshop that are actually Space Marines and don't have to make up weird names and slight stylistic concessions to being a bit different. There is also that issue of not supporting local game stores as well. Definitely not an either-or thing, and you can still buy regularly at them while 3D printing stuff, but could be one potential area of conflict. Overall, I'd say that 3D printing is definitely very viable for a bunch of hobbyists. Lots of people can and do use it to great effect. Though for all of its assets, I don't think that we're ever going to arrive at a point where literally everyone gets a 3D printer. Just doesn't really seem that efficient to have everyone making their own models, when for a lot of people it just makes a lot more sense either to buy from the actual plastic kits or to buy from the people who have the printers. In any case, look forward to hearing all your thoughts on the subject as per usual. Let me know how you use 3D printing to support a Warhammer hobby, or why you choose not to at the moment. As mentioned earlier, if you are feeling like jumping into the space as well, I will just quickly mention that Elegoo affiliate link that I have down in the video description. If you're already sold on picking up one of theirs, then feel free to click that link first. It does help out Auspex Tactics a bit, and you can use that discount code, which I'll also write down in the video description as well. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming. I do tend to post new videos every day, with plenty of model tactics videos. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just quickly like to mention as well that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.